Thank you so much. So, over the course of the last year, we've had this incredible shift in the conversation about the big technology companies, and it's introduced this possibility that these companies, the definition of the big companies, I think, shifts depending on who you talk to, but the Europeans refer to them as GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. And the question of their size, the question of their role in markets, in the public sphere, has elicited a whole big conversation. There was a moment when Mark Zuckerberg was testifying before the Senate when Lindsey Graham turned to him and said, you know, you're a monopoly, and you're probably going to have to get regulated. And Zuckerberg said, you know what? You're right. The internet has grown into a place that is now so big and so messy, we are going to have to regulate it. And Graham said, great, could you send us your proposal for the regulations? And that seemed to me both a telling moment about where we're at, but also kind of hints at maybe some of the perils of regulation. And so we have Renee, we have Noam, and they come at this from from different ways. I think that there's some convergence in thinking, but Renee is a practitioner who's turned into an activist. And before I turn to Noam, I think it would be really useful just to narrate your biography briefly and explain how it is that you went from practitioner to activist, and how that informs the way that you think about this question about tech and regulation.
Yeah, so I have a computer science degree. I had a computer in my house starting from the time I was about 6. My dad's an engineer. I don't remember a time when I was not on the internet, including like sneaking AOL and trying to make it so that you couldn't hear the modem. And after my parents went to bed, I got involved in disinformation research before it was called disinformation research, when I was looking at the anti-vaccine movement and how it had grown on social media. And I was really concerned I was a new parent at that point. And I'd always found the movement somewhat distasteful, but it was very much personalized for me when I was trying to find a preschool for my son and realized that California's vaccination rates were terrible. It just so happened that the measles outbreak happened almost immediately after I started doing this search, and literally, don't waste an epidemic. Lawmakers decided that we were going to change the law and try to deal with this, and social media exploded. Now, I'd been on Twitter for years at this point, but I reached out to the congressman up in Sacramento and I said, I'd like to help you. I'd like to, I'm an analyst, I can help you understand what's going on. There's a lot of really weird stuff happening in these hashtags. There are a lot of people who are pretending to be Californian. There are a lot of brand new accounts. There's a lot of automation where we're just seeing people spam these hashtags about these bills. And so the legislators are polling on this law at 85% positive, and the social media conversation is almost 99% negative, including extensive amounts of harassment, doxing, and threats to try to intimidate people who were speaking out in favor of the law, to try to silence them and wipe them off the internet. So this was an example where myself and another data scientist mapped the network. And what we found were these kind of like clusters of manipulation, but we also saw the ways in which the narrative would change with each vote. And we took that information, we took it to the lawmakers, and we said the reason you're seeing this disparity in polling is that actually 60% of the tweets are being sent by I think it was like 0.025% of the accounts having the conversation. So we're saying this is a deeply manipulated narrative. This is manufactured consensus. At the time, it wasn't really about bots. It was just about using things like IFT and other platforms to just make sure that your account is just tweeting all day long.
Who was doing the manipulation?
It was really true believers. It was. I'm not saying at all that this was a foreign power interfering. That came later. These were just domestic ideologues who were much more effective at using marketing techniques than other people were. And it was this notion that true believers could really amplify their position and make themselves look much bigger than they were through the strategic use of automation, which the platform saw as free speech. So to kind of progress through there, we did in fact get the law passed. The fact that we were able to show them how manipulated this conversation was made them feel more confident when they talked to people in their district, that was the real information and what was happening online was not. Kind of following that, simultaneously, we were seeing the rise of ISIS on social media. And the same type of analysis I was doing, this network analysis, was being done by other folks who were looking at ISIS and their attempt to kind of take control using standard marketing techniques to build the virtual caliphate. So then we realized that the same playbook that was being run by conspiracy theorists was being run by terrorists. And again, what we heard from the platforms is, well, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and if we take down ISIS content, what are we going to have to take down next? I found that absolutely galling. Following that, I started doing some of the investigation into the Russia thing, in part motivated by the fact that we heard these statements that it was only $100,000 worth of ads, not a whole lot of people saw it. So rather than a transparent acknowledgement that this had happened and they had screwed up, instead we had to fight the battle to get to the acknowledgement that literally hundreds of millions of people had seen this stuff. So I guess that's where I felt like the best thing I could do at that point was start meeting with Congress members and saying, like, this is how it happens. Let me write you like the social media 101 explainer, the disinformation 101 explainer, and let's just walk through how this happens. And we're really relying on you to hold the companies to account, and at a minimum, to hold hearings to have them account to the American people for what happened in our election.
So before I turn to Noam, first of all, I'm going to lay my cards on the table and say that a mutual friend of ours has described Renee as the national treasure just because of the work that she's done, which is so hard, just kind of mapping the ways in which these platforms, these systems have been manipulated, the ways in which kind of the conventional techniques of, what you're saying, from marketing and business, the rules of the platforms are being exploited by these bad actors. So in terms of this biography, where does that leave you in the story, this narrative that you're telling, and these kind of terrible realizations that you've come to? Where does that leave you in terms of thinking about the problem? What is the problem that you would ideally want government to solve?
So right now, I would say the biggest problem is no one is in charge. Everything that happens very ad hoc. We have a network of activists and activist communities that has really grown up to civil society speaking in a certain way. Government doesn't fully understand the problem, so a lot of what we do is just this communication back and forth. They're not stupid by any stretch. It's just that this is not the core competency, and it's a complex problem. But the fact that there's no, I was a trader on Wall Street for 7 years. And Wall Street had the SEC, we had FINRA, we had the exchanges. We had a regulatory framework in place. So when manipulative algorithms came to Wall Street, protection of market integrity was absolutely paramount because the markets don't function if they're manipulated. And so this regulatory body, this collection, self-regulatory, regulatory, and exchanges acting as independent actors, was able to come together to say we have to treat this as a systemic threat. Now we have a systemic threat to the information markets, but no one is in charge. There is no regulatory agency. Very few people understand the problem, and we've been like building the plane while flying it, of grabbing civil society, government, and then I do actually try to engage with the tech platforms quite a bit because I feel like they have the greatest levers in the short term to make a difference. So it's kind of like the simultaneous appeal for self-regulation plus recognizing that self-regulation doesn't work if there's no stick. So what is the oversight body that fills that gap?
Right. Well, it's fascinating, and so that brings us to Noam. And Noam, you've written about technology for a very long time. You've written a really important book about Silicon Valley that traces its kind of the underlying political, intellectual history of the place. And so the story you tell really is one where Renee mentioned the term self-regulation. I think that in some ways that's kind of the story that they prefer to tell about themselves, right?
Yeah, I was thinking before coming here about, there's a quote from Upton Sinclair that says, it's hard to have someone learn something that their livelihood is based on not acknowledging. And I think they kind of think there's an exception if you're super rich. It's kind of like the Donald Trump exception. I'm too rich to be corrupted. I think Facebook always argues that he doesn't, as Mark Zuckerberg will argue that he doesn't care about money. He could have sold the company for $1 billion if he wanted. And but in fact, I think it really is a bad path to have self-regulated. And I think what my book was trying to do was to look at let's take what Renee was saying about the financial markets and how there's a good there as a financial market that they want to protect, and there's organizations that do it, and we all kind of invested in the market working well. Well, the problem is that the ideology, I would say, behind so much of Silicon Valley is hyper-individualistic. So there really isn't this investment in what is this thing called the public square that I don't think they feel that they have to defend it. It's like if you view life as a series of individuals making choices, learning about things, saying whatever they want, having no restrictions on them, it can seem really quaint or a mistake to have rules on speech, on hate
So
speech.
just to tie these
So,
two things together,
Sure.
what you're saying is that it's a feature of the system.
Yes.
This is not a bug, that
Right.
the type of disinformation that Renee is describing proliferates on these platforms because they don't view themselves as having to take any sort of
Sure.
greater sense of responsibility.
And pertinent to the point of this conversation. So that's one thing I wanted to sort of trace, the kind of the hacker ethos, which was hyper, against authority, and for good reasons. That we're the smartest, we know what we're doing. They would kind of make fun of administrators who would come in and tell them what to do. And then you have the role of Stanford to kind of encourage people to make money from their investments, from their inventions, and that's kind of led us to where we are today. And it's almost like we have to change the thinking, I think, and build up the civic sphere to counteract what's going on, because I think there's no other way out.
Before
really.
we turn
Yes.
to solutions, and
Sure,
I
sure.
just want to, I'm curious, what Renee, since you have so much interaction with the platforms themselves, and you've tried to dialogue with them and prod them to perform better, is it, in terms of this ultimate question of whether we can count on the companies to ultimately police themselves, out of your experience, what can you say about that as a path?
I think in terms of immediate fixes, there are a lot of very smart people who've been hired into these places now, who are really prioritizing detection, mitigation. Mexico is having an election right now. There are some Twitter botnets. We can communicate these things to Twitter. Facebook announced a formal partnership with a group called Digital Forensic Research Lab, excellent organization out of the Atlantic Council. Again, information sharing. Right now, a lot of what I do is just try to facilitate information sharing, because when there's a botnet influencing a Mexican election, if Twitter has not found it itself, that's something Twitter needs to know. They need to deal with it, and then they also need to investigate why they didn't find that themselves. So a lot of it is really kind of short-term fixes, and then over the longer term, developing conversations about improved relationships with researchers, which we finally achieved.
Yeah.
Even to their credit, I have to say, I thought we started having those conversations back in December, where I was like, it'd be really great for us to have the opportunity to look at your data, to scope out projects. I thought that was going to get shut down after Cambridge Analytica. I thought they'd be like, never again, no researchers, ever again. Instead, they did kind of come up with a partnership and a framework with SSRC. So it's interesting, because I feel like some people think that if you're a critic and you say things like that they are taking steps forward, that you've somehow become an apologist. I know it's unsatisfying to be the moderate, but I do actually think that they are taking steps. Do I think that it means that there is no need for regulation? No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Because the reason that a lot of these steps are taken is because of the sustained efforts, particularly leading up to the tech hearings, to help the media tell these stories, to get these things that we'd been seeing for years, but nobody paid attention. I would go give talks at Google I/O, and like one or two engineers would come up and say I think this is a really big problem, but then the more traditional response was like, you're Chicken Little telling us the sky is falling, It's not really falling. And then November 2016 happens, and you're like, the sky just fell.
Yeah.
It happened. Let's do something about it.
So no, I was going to say, let's just we need to be clear that in terms of talking about regulation, that we're talking about a whole series of problems, right? It's disinformation is one thing, but then there's privacy, there's concentration questions. If you were thinking about regulation in the abstract, and even as you kind of parse the debate as it's unfolding now, what are we talking about when we say big tech should be regulated?
Yeah, and first I want to say, I don't think you're a moderator. You seem like you're a practitioner, which is like super important to have someone who's doing like the work. And I was going to say the other kind of issue that's sort of systemic is the scale idea, the idea that it's so vital, and it's been pounded into, I think about like when Peter Thiel's first advice as an outside investor to Facebook was that you have to grow and get the network effect. And like that's such a drive for everything that the companies are doing, is to grow bigger. And that is a source of a lot of the problems, that when you're bigger, you really can't have human scale solutions to problems. You have to have automated solutions to problems, and those are going to have all the flaws that we talk about. So I do think that regulation, and I think the other thing I would say about regulation beyond, so I think it leads to kind of the question of breaking up these companies and making them smaller. But I think the other thing, we were on a panel before, and like we talk a lot about regulation in terms of the things you're talking about, privacy and competition. But there is this, I wrote a piece, an op-ed in the Times about how looking at the Voting Rights Act and how it played out in the 2016 election, how Facebook really allowed the Trump campaign to target ads at African Americans that, for all we know, they don't know what their ads are. They disappear. They're called dark ads, right? There's no record of them. And so these are, when we talk about regulations, it's not always got to be regulations that are specific to these companies and to the internet. We have regulations that we as a society have always championed, like fair elections. And that is a principle that can be applied to the internet. It doesn't have to be an internet-based regulation.
This is really, I mean, I think you're making an excellent point. And so let's start at this ground level, which is that regulation exists in all shapes and sizes, that there are the grandiose ones that we're talking about breaking up a big company. There are the grandiose ones that Europeans are pursuing. But when it comes to preserving the integrity of elections, are there really simple things that should be enacted tomorrow that we're somehow glossing over?
Well, I feel they took steps, right? I feel like making the ads transparent. I think they'll never do it again. They will never have a system where you can take out an ad, have it disappear, have no record of it, have no concept of what might have been said and whether it violated laws. So that won't ever happen again. And their solution, right? We talked about this other panel, is to sort of outsource a lot of the work. They're going to have the ads be very transparent, say who took them out, and Facebook is very upfront about saying we're going to count on the press or advocates or activists to look and see what's going on there, look at those lies that campaign placed, and that is a way of doing it. I mean, it is I guess it leads to a larger question that these companies are making so much money, and they're having, it's sort of, what do they call it, like
outsourced.
No, but I'm saying socialism for us and competition for everyone else. I mean, like they're guaranteeing their own income, and they're having everyone else sort of farm out that problem to the public, and having that be socialized. All the work of solving how to stop fake ads and bad ads is going to be done by the public. So I think a robust government agency would be a better path. Yeah.
Renee, but on the specific question of electioneering, I was shocked that, I mean, maybe I'm not shocked, but I am theoretically shocked that after this last election where you had clear manipulation, you had the fair ads, honest ads, honest, fair, equal, just, whatever, ads act, but there wasn't really a big regulatory push to try to come up with some basic solutions to extend laws that exist in other areas of electioneering to the internet. Why is it? Are there obvious things to do?
I think that one of the reasons for why was that there was not some of these, like, it's very, 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 very slow, and then everything happens all at once.
Yeah.
I feel like after election 2016, that was when the reckoning started, and there hadn't really been this lead up. There was so much. There was like a year of investigation. The tech hearings, we started advocating for them in September 2017. They finally happened in, I think, October, November 2017. So the timeline's a little hazy for me right now. I think that it was just now we can do something.
Yeah.
Because there was support, there was momentum, there was Lindsey Graham talking about antitrust. I did not see that coming, Yeah. So there's been kind of a constellation of efforts where various organizations that have, kind of complained quietly for a while are now all of a sudden realizing they have the ear of lawmakers, they can advocate for things. Honest Ads Act, a lot of, Facebook saw that coming and then preemptively said, well, here's what we're going to do instead, right? And there's an automation bill moving through the legislature in California to try to mandate disclosure of bots. I think that there's some structural things that need to be fixed with it, but it is a really interesting stick because it has passed the Senate and now it's in the Assembly, where we're waiting to see, does Twitter try to preempt this by taking on this disclosure, thinking about disclosure and disclosing automated accounts or indicating automated accounts, which is something that we've been talking about for years. So I think some of it is, what do we ask for now that there's the opportunity to ask for things? Yeah. And so open markets and the antitrust guys are really, filling a lot of the space in the regulatory conversation. The privacy people, there's a privacy bill in California right now too. Really remarkable effort there.
That's a big deal, right?
Yeah, so the vote is today. I believe it has to be signed by today. And here, there's an interesting, I can explain this. California has a kind of convoluted system of direct democracy called the proposition system, where you can, individual can raise funds, gather signatures, and have a proposition put on the ballot, at which point direct democracy kicks in, people vote on the proposition, up or down, simple majority most of the time. And there's a California GDPR proposition that basically says that you own your data, you can request it to be removed. It has a very punitive system of fining. Ironically, a law was introduced nearly simultaneously. The tech platforms saw the opportunity to weigh in on the formation of the law, which is still like a GDPR light. It has the proposition penalties are 10 times stricter than the ones in the law, so they're in the unique position now of advocating for this law to be passed by today, because if it's passed by today, then the proposition can be pulled from the ballot. If it is not passed by today, the proposition stays, and then they have to run a complicated campaign trying to educate the public and persuade the public to vote against regulation. It's a really interesting dynamic that's happening here, in part also because many of us, myself included, feel that you can only amend a proposition with another proposition, which means if your proposition goes bad, you have to do the whole fundraising, signature gathering, proposition fight again. So it's actually quite preferable to pass it through the legislature, in my opinion. But this is where we're seeing this tension between can you rush something through that the tech platforms did weigh in on, or is it better to go with a much more punitive approach where the people who are really kind of like crying for blood want to see that proposition on the ballot? So it's
it's a microcosm of what is probably coming on a national scene, where the tech companies see that there's this political pressure building, regulatory pressure is going to start to build, and they do what other monopolies have done in the past, which is that you rush toward, instead of fighting regulation, you rush to start to shape it, and you start to broker a deal with the government where you say, you know what, if you protect our monopolies, we'll accept regulation, and we've seen how that's turned out in the past.
Right. Yeah, it's like regulatory capture, right?
Yeah.
The phrase for it. Yeah. I always think that, when you write a book about this, you're always kind of asked, what are your solutions? And, Frank and I have been talking about this for a long time. And like, a new thought, like from the last discussion we had, it seemed like so much of the harm that we were identifying, particularly there was one kind of researcher who said it comes from the segmentation, the way the data, not just the collection of big data, but the way that it's being used so much to target, because that, and Renee was talking all about that, how it allows these messages to be amplified and kind of kept in this a group that doesn't
the filter bubble,
but like really, but we're talking about filter bubble not in this kind of abstract way. Oh, I always kind of look for people who agree with me, but like literally, I'm going to be funneled stuff that based on my identification. It could be racial, it could be political or any sort of way, and that is really like the crux of the problem, and it's like that is where kind of all of the bad effects stem from. It's what breaks down the society, the civil society, when you see people only as groups to be targeted and sold and to told news that way, and so I feel like that might be where regulation ought to go.
But just as we talk through these questions, I'm just going to play devil's advocate, because even though I'm pro regulation, I also can very easily see some of the downsides, at least. Not necessarily to antitrust, even with antitrust, which I'm fervently in favor of, I see downsides. But let's just look at the question of regulating the sort of data problems that you're talking about, or even the misinformation problems that you're talking about. Aren't you then extending government into the realm of speech and into the realm of trying to regulate the public square? And you don't need to look very far in this world to see dangerous examples of states, working with social media companies in order to manipulate the public.
Right, but there also are dangerous scenarios when private companies regulate speech, and they are able to do that right now. I mean, and I do think, like, take something like the right to be forgotten. I find that like a more useful one to think about, because
explain what the right is.
The right to be forgotten is this idea that and it's in Europe, it's where it's imposed. Is the idea that something happened to me 20 years ago and it pops up the first result on a search, and I should have the right to say, take that down. Like I committed a crime, but I've served my time, or something embarrassing happened of whatever sort. And it's this idea of saying that you're allowed to control your portrayal in the world, and the idea that in the past 20 years was a long time, and it wouldn't be the first thing someone sees, wouldn't be about your divorce or about your bankruptcy. And to me, that's eminently reasonable. Like, Wikipedia is a group I write a lot about, and they are doing a lot of good work, but they're really opposed to that, and they see it as a free speech issue, and they see it as like denying history, and how can you,
but
I totally get it. And I would never say that regulation has got to clear only good and no laws. I'm saying that we as a society, that is a good trade-off, in my opinion. Maybe that's something we have to discuss and talk about politically. Clearly, regulating, this is going back to what my book's about, like the extreme view of freedom, that you should be allowed to say whatever you want and not recognize the consequences. So if free speech online means that women are not comfortable participating, that is a real cost. So I understand that why, and I think it's funny. It's like, I think what Facebook and other Silicon Valley companies do is argue this, that you're not making a choice, but that they have no opinion. They're just letting the freedom go. But I mean, as we know from Rush or other wise people have said, if you don't make a choice, that's still a choice. Like if you decide to not have any regulation on how the public sphere operates, that is a choice with real consequences, and it's the same as if you passed a law saying that. I mean, that's all I would.
But I'm really struck by Renee's analogy to the financial system, which is that you have this big, massive superstructure that's subsuming large chunks of the economy, and we're at the point where it's, the automobile has been invented, and it's running around on streets, but we don't yet have stop signs or seat belts or fuel efficiency standards. And so it is this kind of anarchic state that you describe as kind of a libertarian paradise, but we are really in this very early stage where we all know that it needs to be cleaned up in certain ways or fixed, but it's very difficult. I think it's just striking to me how the critique has kind of outstripped the policy. And so
I think they actually, in one-on-one conversations, especially with engineers in the Valley, you do get a sense that people believe that there is a need for standards. How do we think about shared standards? Now, this was something where it used to be kind of like a third rail, like you couldn't say it because the idea that like the platforms all had their own culture and so on and so forth. But now they see it as every time they moderate something, they face a gigantic backlash. Somebody screams censorship. It's such a predictable experience for them every single time. And I think they're finally starting to see it now as, what if we came together as an industry and we said, like, this is how we're going to think about standards. This is how we're going to think about conduct. This is how we're going to think about moderation. This is how we're going to think about harassment. Not as a mandated, I've actually never heard a Washington staffer, they all try very hard to stay away from the speech issues. They don't believe that they should be intervening there. They see it more as like they'll get in with the election-related content that's a particular type of speech that already, to your point, has certain regulation around it. I have not seen them in any way advance the idea of the government touching on any of the moderation or speech-related things. But I do think that there's a shift where within industry people are starting to have that conversation. Within the Valley, we're saying, like, are there decency type standards?
And increasing comfort in Silicon Valley with the prospect that government is going to intervene and come up with some sort of.
Another idea that, like, I remember early on thinking about what about the utility model? Like, I feel like the thing that's funny when you're talking about cars would be as if the car industry said, we're going to install traffic lights, we'll take care of it, all of it. And I sometimes think when I hear the Silicon Valley leaders talk about all the good that their products do, which are amazing. I like, as a thought experiment, would imagine if a company controlled water and they could have ads about, our plants grow because of Facebook water. Isn't it amazing? And people drink it every day and have happy lives. And it's like, you could take the view, it's a utility. It's a very important thing and makes money for people, but it should be highly regulated and have a certain set profit to keep it going.
Let's open it up to questions.
Sure. Okay.
But while we're getting the first question, just explain what you mean by the utility model. Are you talking about, so with Google, let's just be precise.
Sure, Google, good.
With Google, are we nationalizing Google? Are we turning it into, just
like the Yellow Pages or the White Page? Like the Yellow Pages, I guess, were a regulated company created these pages. Yeah. They're very useful. I guess they were allowed to make a certain amount of profit. I'm just wondering why, I'm asking you two as well. I wonder why that isn't something talked about more, where it it's very against the notion you should make billions of dollars from these great inventions. It certainly takes that off the table. But why not take the view this is like a search engine is a vital resource. It's like just like water. It's vital to how the internet operates, and you can't do it without it.
It's an essential piece of infrastructure. That
Sure, as is I would say the way to communicate through Facebook, but something like that. And why not just regulate it as a utility? I guess you lock in their profits, make sure they run well, and that kind of thing. I mean,
yeah. Well, let's open it up for questions. So, here.
So I was in the previous one about the menace of disinformation, and when you were talking about the rapid advance of the fake Yelp and the anti-fake Yelp and the anti-fake Yelp, it struck me, well, that's a nearly instantaneous process. Yeah. And at the same time, if we're looking at regulatory as part of the answer, that can't the legislative process can't be anywhere near as fast as that. So what's the upper bound of what we can expect from regulatory as an effective?
So as I understand the question, just for the people in the back, because I know the mic was going, it's regulation is fundamentally slow, and this is an arms race. Particularly in the last session, we were talking about kind of tactics and particular facets of manipulation. So how do you balance the two? I would say my response to that is I believe this is an information war. I believe that there are structural issues that enable the platforms to be used in a certain way. The way I see my work is, as a practitioner, understanding the mechanisms by which those campaigns happen. The best people to fix those things as they happen are the platforms, and that's why I do spend so much time trying to talk to engineers about this is what we're seeing, this is how it's happening. Like, what do you think about that? But then on the longer term, to think about what are how do we think about the way that this is facilitated because they know so much about us, and where does what are the implications of changing privacy regulations on the downstream effects of the ability to target? I'm not saying that's something I'm personally advocating for, but we do look at what are here is the tactical issue strategically. Besides just interceding in each individual tactic, how do we think about in the long game what mitigates some of the problems through things like ad disclosures now actually will make some impact. It's not the be all and end all, but it will make some impact on the ability to use ads to target people, to spread disinformation.
Can we just briefly on this, which is that I think that you're absolutely right that when it comes to the immediate examples, there's the limits to how much you can, certainly limits to what government can do to police it in real time. The practitioners certainly could police it in real time, but I think we have to examine the underlying architecture of the systems, and there are, I think, design flaws in them that would be corrected both by the privacy regulations that Renee is talking about, but also I think competition could be hugely helpful to spurring these companies to do better. So for instance, the fact that there's only one search engine that we think of, there's really no competition among search engines to do better in terms of protecting our privacy. And so they're kind of lazily going around collecting their monopolistic rents and doing nothing to fundamentally address some of these issues that are at the core of disinformation and manipulation.
Because they can't lose their audience, fundamentally. That's the network effect.
That's it.
Yeah.
Following that point about monopoly, isn't it, and I know very little about this area, but isn't it the case that we're talking about really proprietary systems like Google and Facebook, and there are open source systems too, which might let more light shine in, and blockchain is a potential opportunity there where linking computers more democratically, it's really open source. And would that help in terms of the transparency? Any thoughts about that?
Do you want to tackle that one?
Is that the decentralized net? I don't, is that what,
I'll unless you guys want to answer it. My only thing is we have to address the problem as it exists now, and we can kind of wishfully sit around for there to be technological solutions that might arise, and of course, this is one of the profound challenges that faces regulators, which is that you're dealing with these massive systems, and it's hard to predict how things will move, but you see things locked into a pattern for long enough, and you don't see a response quickly emerging on the horizon, then I think the time has arisen for government to consider stepping in. These other solutions could be great, but it seems to me like they're also pretty far.
And to that point, one of the main way to regulate is that whenever there is a rival kind of network, right? Instagram early on was growing and was seen. Facebook bought it, or WhatsApp. So that is something that obviously regulators should really be doing more of. They're not even allowing other kind of organic networks that could grow, and then I guess Instagram could become more like Facebook if it were separately owned, and instead it's brought into the morass of Facebook and integrated into it. So.
Okay.
You want to ask she was at?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to connect the two themes you alluded to. I wanted to connect two themes you alluded to on the whole censorship, free speech thing with the utility thing, because I think they're connected. And it feels like as they've gotten so much scale so rapidly, they're at this inflection point of deciding, are they a platform, like a public forum, basically, which would fall under, I think, Title V of the Telecommunications Act, and then maybe that's a road to utility status down the road. Or are they a publisher, which means free expression of speech and no censorship of any kind, because hate speech is not a protected class, and they wouldn't do that. And I think Zuckerberg was even grilled on this and didn't have a very satisfactory answer in one of the hearings. But if the government were to pursue this line of questioning for them, how do you think the story ends, and what's the logical endpoint of kind of which side of that they want to be?
Wow. I mean, you thought on that, Frank? I mean, like, whether, they clearly are evolving, right, on whether to think of themselves as publishers or not. And you're pointing out that they have, their advantages and disadvantages tactically for them.
Well, the CDA 230 debate has been an interesting part of it.
Oh, I think you should explain that.
Oh.
Yeah, no.
CDA 230 is the Communications Decency Act, and it's come up quite a bit because it's a provision that says that they have carte blanche to moderate as platforms. I think it's intermediary liability is the. I am not a lawyer, by the way, but it's the safe harbor provision that says that they are not liable for the content that their users post on their platform. One of the areas of regulation that we did see really early and out of the gate was carve-outs for specific things related to 230. So saying that you are not, we will no longer indemnify you if you host content related to sex trafficking. That was SOSTA, I think was a couple
SESTA,
different.
right?
I think SESTA became SOSTA.
Okay.
Anyway, it was one of these legal things. It was passed quite quickly, and it did kind of strip liability protection for that particular type of content. The interesting second order effect, though, was that because so much of this is like, well, how do you decide if it's sex trafficking or if the woman's posted her own ad herself? Backpage was the platform in question here. Craigslist and a number of others that hosted voluntary adult services and whatnot eliminated all that content because they didn't want to be seen as having any liability. Like, they wanted to be so far on the right side of that law. The thing that was interesting about CDA 230, though, is that it actually gives them the right to moderate. So it gives them the right to proactively, preemptively do whatever they want. I mean, they have carte blanche to moderate. If they don't like what you've said, they can take it down. It's a private platform. But what they chose to use 230 for was to do the opposite, was to say, we're not liable if the content stays, so we're just going to let the content stay, because then we don't have to have these fights about censorship and so on and so forth. So there's this, I think 1994 was when CDA 230 was written. So looking at how is the internet involved in that time, and at the same time realizing that doing these carve-outs actually does have weird kind of downstream effects. So I think no one wants to rush the regulation.
I mean, one thing I've written about is the need to create a data protection agency of some sort. That states have, some states have data protection. A lot of Europe, obviously now, has created this comprehensive regime. But if you start to look at kind of the externalities of data collection, you look at how fundamental it is to our sense of self to have these kind of intimate things then kind of be released into the public sphere. These companies are essentially trustees of material that they sometimes claim to own, but they should not be accepted as the owners of. And so carrying responsibility for that information, for that data, I think means that we have the right to kind of heap obligations upon them.
I shouldn't have hemmed and hawed about I mean, I think it is important that that Facebook is a publisher or Google. I think that's important, and that they have to acknowledge it. I mean, I think that's been the kind of claim. I come from the newspaper world, and they are having a huge effect on the newspaper world. They are where people get news from. It seems like it's and Renee's been kind of explaining the whole kind of fallacy of being the safe harbor where everything is published but they have no accountability for it. That's not to me, that's not a viable system. I think it's not viable. I think to have one publisher control 30% or 50% of the news either. But I think they were kind of doing some sleight of hand by claiming they're not a publisher.
Yeah.
I think it's just prima facie they are a publisher, and that's what we have to think of them.
Yeah. Who's next? Yep.
Hi, my name is Don Baker, and I'm a former antitrust enforcer.
There we
Okay.
go.
Big time. He's a legend.
Should come up here.
In comes the cavalry.
And it seems to me that a core purpose of antitrust is to create markets that create incentives as an alternative to prohibitions.
Yes.
Carrots versus sticks. And so as I sit here and people say we've got to do a lot of things in the antitrust area, I would welcome the suggestions from the panel as to what it should be. Obviously, I think
Noam.
you
Yeah,
mentioned mergers, but
Yeah.
is there a broader mandate that we antitrust believers
Yeah.
should be championing?
All right. This
For
happens
you
to
too.
be.
This is like the top
Zero.
picture
Yeah.
right there.
So, so as Don knows much better than I do, the standards that we've used for thinking about antitrust have shifted considerably over time. That once upon a time, antitrust was concerned with questions about democracy, about the health of producers, and it shifted into this very narrow stricture where Robert Bork's idea that antitrust should only be concerned with the welfare of consumers, which means it should only be concerned if a monopoly is abusing its power in order to jack up prices. Everything was about prices. And with these companies, they're giving away their stuff for free. And so existing antitrust jurisprudence and regulation is really not up to the task. And so we need to reinvent the way that we think about antitrust. And I don't really we can't count on the courts, clearly, based on observations from this past week. I'm not sure we can count on the regulators. I think we need to begin to consider a legislative renewal of our antitrust laws. But even within the existing antitrust laws, I think that there are these merger questions that Noam has talked about where they could be much more active. And I think even just calling attention to the problem and investigating and putting pressure on some of these kind of these horizontal alignments that have been created could restrain some of their behavior. If they were worried that the government might come after them, they wouldn't necessarily act with such impunity. Yes.
My name is Robert Potter. I'd like to touch the two extremes, I think, of regulation. One is advertising, from somebody putting a billboard on their front lawn to skywriting to Facebook. I think it's my responsibility to determine what's real information, what's misleading information, what's fuzzy information. But the one that I can't is voting. You said that there was clear manipulation. How many votes were changed that leads you to say there was clear manipulation?
I was talking about that. Yeah, I don't know.
Wait,
okay.
and then tell me the regulation that you would make if you were czar of regulation, and you could write a regulation this afternoon that would solve that problem.
Okay. You want
Well,
to
some of
jump in
it
first?
was a straightforward, as came up in the hearing, the straightforward point that if you take out a TV ad, and I think they talked about it in South Dakota, you have to register, and when you took out a political ad on Facebook, you didn't, so you didn't have to have any disclosure. And then furthermore, what's that? That's an ad. Or was that what you're talking
You
about?
asked about ads.
Were you talking about ads or not? I'm sorry.
I said, how many votes were changed?
Well, but first,
sure how that's
proving the votes change is going to be very, very difficult. I'm only saying things that went against our laws and the way we, that don't fit with the laws we have for other media. So I'm saying likewise, there were ads that were placed that were, we can look at the Russia ads that were released that were heightening racial tension, that were playing, they were targeted towards certain groups, and were I'm not sure they were illegal. I would say these are something that a honorable company wouldn't want to be trafficking in, and some disappeared, I'm saying. So if you're going to look for a direct causality between an ad and a vote, that's one of the real mysteries. I think advertisers, people always claim, I'm not being convinced by advertising, that people spend billions of dollars taking out ads. It's a real conundrum.
Renee's actually, I think you have the best probably empirical sense of not necessarily votes that were changed, because I don't think anybody could answer that question, but just how it functions, the outcome of effects of manipulation.
So we think about it in a couple ways. Like, there's production of content, we can track that really easily. There's consumption of content, we can get that through analytics. Then there's absorption of content, and that's what you're getting at with it. Did it change hearts and minds? The way that we look at that is that is the fuzziest thing. That is where the platforms have way more information than outside researchers. And that's because with the platforms, they can see that if somebody sees a particular type of content, do they proactively go and search for it the next time? If the recommendation engine serves them 6 groups, which one do they pick? These are things that we on the outside do not have access to, and that's why we've been asking for better research relationships to dig into the answer of what impact does it have. But what I will say is one thing that we can see is that we see shifts in language. So we see, example of, we see trolls that will come in, they'll use a particular term or a collection of terms, and then they will blanket the conversation. The reason that the Russians weren't just on one platform is because what you need to do, as you would do in any marketing campaign, is you blanket the internet. And you use your terms, and you use your memes, and you use things that people are going to transmit person to person. We literally look at epidemiology as the model for information dispersal at this point. I don't want to go down too deep in the weeds. I know we're almost out of time.
We just get the wrap-up sign. But it's also, isn't the point also that it's not just that people were manipulated to vote one way, that there's suppression, that it's kind of an ecosystem, and it's just very hard to reduce.
But I thought Facebook did a study where they talked about how they could encourage voting, right? And they found a very traceable.
Oh yeah, they wrote a case study.
They pulled it down.
It's not on the internet
because it was kind
anymore.
of scary. It was proving that if they encouraged people to vote in certain regions, the voting rate went up. Not who to vote for, but just to vote. And that was an awesome power they recognized they had, and that was kind of scary. So I don't know. Luckily, the ballot is secret, so we're never going to know.
I think it was maybe the FTC that did a consumer protection study where they realized that they could actually back out specifically who you were targeting with small enough audience sizes in the Facebook ad tool. They could actually they could identify people. Oh, I see. Yeah. So there have been a couple of interesting studies that have looked at mechanics around this stuff.
I want to go for longer, but they won't let us. No. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, panel.